Cordelia Vane straightened the stack of ledgers under her arm and pushed through the tall oak doors of Oakhaven Hall before the footman could announce her properly. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, ever since word reached her that Duke Benedict Sterling was seeking a new estate manager for his sprawling network of canals and trade offices. She needed this position more than she had ever needed anything in her 24 years. The study she was shown into was colder than she expected, all dark wood and tall windows that let in gray November light. Duke Benedict Sterling sat behind a desk, piled with papers, a man perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp features and the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller. He did not rise when she entered. "Miss Vane," he said, not looking up from whatever he was reading. "I was told a woman had applied for the estate manager's post. I assumed it was an error in the letter. There is no error, Your Grace." Cordelia stepped forward and set her ledgers on the edge of his desk, careful not to disturb his papers. "My father managed a merchant fleet for 11 years before his death. I kept his books alongside him since I was 15. I understand shipping manifests, tariff schedules, and warehouse accounts better than most men twice my age." He finally looked up, and his eyes moved over her plain traveling dress, her ink-stained gloves, the worn leather satchel at her side. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only a kind of tired assessment, as though he were counting the cost of something. "Your father was Thomas Vane," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. The Vane shipping line collapsed a decade ago. Bankruptcy, debts sold off, the whole enterprise dismantled within a year." He set down his pen, "And now his daughter wishes to manage my accounts. I wish to earn a wage, Your Grace, and I am well suited to earning it honestly." She kept her chin level, though her heart was beating hard enough that she feared he could hear it. "My father's debts did not vanish when he died. They passed to me. I have creditors calling at my door every month, and I intend to pay every shilling I owe, but I cannot do that without employment." Something shifted in his expression then, something she could not name. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, as though he were choosing each word with great care. "I have no need of an estate manager, Miss Vane." Her stomach dropped. She had walked 3 miles in the cold, borrowed a decent bonnet from her neighbor, and rehearsed her father's account figures until she could recite them in her sleep, all for nothing. "Then, I apologize for wasting your time, Your Grace." She reached for her ledgers, her fingers trembling slightly as she gathered them. "Sit down, Miss Vane." She froze. It was not a request. "I said I have no need of an estate manager. I did not say I had no need of you." He turned from the window to face her fully now. "What I require is a wife." The words landed so strangely in the cold study that for a moment Cordelia thought she had misheard him. She lowered herself slowly into the chair, across from his desk, her ledgers forgotten in her lap. "Your Grace, I came here seeking employment, not, I am aware of what you came seeking." He returned to his seat, folding his hands atop the desk. "Allow me to be plain, since you have shown yourself capable of plain speaking. My canal network stretches across 4 counties. Your father's shipping charters, before they were sold off, held rights to ports and river access that my land cannot touch. Combined, the two would form a trade route unmatched by any house in England. Separately, they are worth considerably less." "The charters were sold," Cordelia said carefully. "My family holds nothing now. Your family holds the name, Miss Vane, and the legal claim attached to it, which is worth more than you realize. A marriage between us would settle every debt you carry, in full, within the week. In exchange, I gain a partner whose family name still commands respect among the old shipping guilds, and whose knowledge of trade, by your own account, exceeds that of most men I employ." Cordelia stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was a jest, some flicker at the corner of his mouth. There was none. His face remained composed, almost businesslike, as though he were proposing a contract for grain rather than a marriage. "You are asking me to marry a stranger," she said quietly. "I am asking you to consider an arrangement that solves both our difficulties. I need a wife, more than I need a servant, Miss Vane. A servant follows instruction. A wife shares in consequence and shares in reward." He leaned forward slightly. "You may take a fortnight to consider it, if you wish. But I suspect your creditors will not extend you the same courtesy." Cordelia's mouth had gone dry. She thought of the letters piling on her table at home, the threats growing sharper with each passing week, the small rented room she could barely afford. And beneath all of it, a colder thought she could not push away, the memory of how quickly her father's ships had vanished from his hands, sold to buyers no one had ever named. "I will need more than a fortnight to understand what you are truly offering, Your Grace," she said at last. For the first time, something like the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Then let us begin with the terms." Cordelia did not sleep that night. She sat at the small writing table in her rented room above the chandler's shop, a single candle burning low, and pulled from an old trunk the papers she had not touched in years. Her father's trade registries, bills of sale, correspondence with port authorities. She had kept them out of sentiment rather than purpose, unable to burn what remained of the only life she had known before poverty. By morning she had made her way back to Vane Manor, the family home her father had been forced to sell, but which the new owners, a retired admiral and his wife, allowed her to visit under the pretense of collecting old family belongings. The drawing room, once filled with her mother's furniture, now held someone else's portraits and someone else's silver. Cordelia set her father's ledgers upon the writing desk by the window and began, page by page, to retrace the last year of his business. The numbers told a story she had never fully understood as a girl of 14, too young to grasp what ruin looked like on paper. Her father's fleet had held 6 merchant vessels and rights to 3 river ports. Within the span of 8 months, contracts had been cancelled, insurers had withdrawn their backing, and creditors, who had once extended generous terms, suddenly demanded payment in full. It read like a slow strangulation rather than an accident of bad fortune. What caught her attention, near the bottom of a bundle she had never examined closely, was a bill of transfer dated only weeks before her father's final collapse. The document showed that the Vane shipping routes, the very charters granting access to Rivermouth Port and 2 smaller harbors along the coast, had been sold. Not seized by creditors as she had always believed, but sold, for a sum so small it was almost an insult, to a holding group identified only by a set of initials she did not recognize. No names, no signatures she could place, just a company registered somewhere beyond English waters, according to a customs stamp in the corner of the page. Her father had never spoken of this sale. He had told her, in the last months of his life, that everything had simply been taken from him, swallowed by debt he could not outrun. He had never once mentioned choosing to part with the roots, let alone parting with them for a price that would not have covered a single month's expenses for the fleet. Cordelia sat back in the chair, her candle guttering, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Someone had bought her father's life's work for almost nothing, and done it quietly enough that even his own daughter had never known the transaction existed. She thought of Duke Benedict Sterling's words from the day before. A trade route unmatched by any house in England. He wanted her family's charters combined with his canal network. But if those charters had already been sold 10 years ago to some anonymous group, then either the Duke did not know they had changed hands, or he knew far more than he had let on. There was only one way to find out. She needed access to records she could never obtain as an unmarried woman with no standing and no name that mattered. She needed the kind of legal authority that only a wife could hold over her husband's accounts, and perhaps, if she was clever enough, over accounts that touched her husband's business but did not officially belong to him. By the time the sun rose over the harbor, Cordelia had made her decision, though not for the reasons Duke Stirling believed. She returned to Oakhaven Hall that same afternoon, her ledgers left behind this time, carrying instead only the folded bill of transfer tucked into her sleeve. Benedict received her in the same cold study, though he seemed almost surprised by how quickly she had returned. "I did not expect an answer so soon, Miss Vane. I have conditions," she said, before he could say anything further. "If I am to agree to this arrangement, I will not enter it as a silent partner, in name only. I want full access to the Stirling trade ledgers, including any historical accounts concerning routes, port charters, and past acquisitions. I want co-signatory authority over the merchant accounts, not merely a courtesy title as your Duchess, and I want it in writing, witnessed by a solicitor of my choosing, before any vows are spoken." Benedict studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You negotiate like a merchant, not a bride. You proposed a business arrangement, Your Grace. I intend to treat it as one." A faint sound left him, something close to a laugh, though it did not reach his eyes. "Very well. I will have my solicitor draw the terms this week. Co-signatory authority, full ledger access, and I shall add a clause settling your father's remaining debts within the month. As promised." He paused. "May I ask, what has changed your mind so decisively? Yesterday, you looked as though I had asked you to walk into the sea." Cordelia hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. She was not yet certain whether the Duke was a man deceived or a man deceiving her, and until she knew which, she intended to keep her discovery close. "Circumstances," she said simply. "A woman in my position cannot afford the luxury of sentiment, Your Grace. You have offered a solution to my debts. I have decided to accept it on my own terms." He nodded slowly, seeming to accept the answer, though something in his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, as though he sensed there was more beneath her composed surface than she was willing to share. "Then we are agreed," he said, extending his hand across the desk. "I will have the papers ready within 3 days." Cordelia shook it, her grip steady, despite the storm building quietly inside her. Somewhere in the Stirling accounts, she was certain, lay the answer to who had truly destroyed her family. And now she would have every door in his house unlocked to find it. The solicitor's papers were signed within 3 days, exactly as Benedict had promised, though Cordelia insisted on reading every clause twice before adding her signature. Co-signatory authority over the Stirling merchant accounts. Full access to the trade ledgers, past and present. A settlement of her father's debts to be paid within the month. It was more power than she had dared to hope for, and more than most brides of her station would ever receive. But before any banns were read or wedding clothes fitted, Cordelia made one request that seemed to unsettle Benedict more than any clause in the contract. "I wish to see Rivermouth Port," she told him, "before we are wed. I want to understand what I am agreeing to manage." He had agreed readily enough, perhaps assuming it was simple curiosity, the natural interest of a woman raised among merchant ledgers. He could not have known what she truly hoped to find. They traveled by carriage along the coast road on a gray morning, the air thick with salt and the cries of gulls circling overhead. Rivermouth Port sprawled along the water's edge, a forest of masts and rigging, sailors calling to one another in accents from every corner of England, crates and barrels stacked high along the quay. It had once been familiar to Cordelia, though she had not walked these docks since she was a girl, trailing after her father, watching him inspect cargo with the same sharp attention she now carried herself. Benedict's head steward, a lean man named Geoffrey Malvern, met them at the gate to the main warehouse. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with a manner so smooth and accommodating that Cordelia found herself instinctively cautious of him, the way she had once been cautious of merchants who smiled too readily before naming their price. "Your Grace," Malvern said, bowing low. "And the future Duchess, I presume. What an honor. Shall I show you the loading schedules first, or would you prefer to begin with the warehouse inventories?" "The inventories," Cordelia said, before Benedict could answer. "I should like to see what the port currently holds against what the books record." Something flickered across Malvern's face, gone almost before she could name it. "Of course, my lady, though I must warn you, the records can be tedious reading for someone unfamiliar with our particular system of accounting." "I am quite familiar with accounting systems, Mr. Malvern. I have kept my father's books since I was 15. He bowed again, his smile never wavering, and led them into the counting house at the edge of the docks, where ledgers were stacked upon long tables beneath the watch of 2 clerks, who straightened immediately at the sight of the Duke. Cordelia began working through the most recent quarter's records. Her eyes moving swiftly down columns of figures she understood better than her own handwriting. Timber shipments from the northern forests, grain deliveries from inland farms, brought down the canal system for transport abroad. She cross-referenced the recorded quantities against the warehouse numbers Malvern's clerks provided, and within the hour, a pattern began to surface that made her pulse quicken. "Mr. Malvern," she said, keeping her voice level, "this entry records 400 barrels of grain as damaged beyond sale during transport last month. Written off entirely, no salvage value recorded. A regrettable loss, my lady. The canal barges are not always kind to cargo in poor weather. And this entry, from the month prior, 600 feet of timber, also written off as damaged at sea." She turned another page. "And this one, and this." Benedict, who had been standing near the window, speaking with one of the dockmasters, turned at the change in her tone and crossed the room to look over her shoulder. "That is a great deal of loss for goods traveling such short distances," he said slowly. "It is more than a great deal, Your Grace. It is nearly every 3rd shipment for the past 6 months." Cordelia rose from the table and walked to the door. "I should like to see the warehouse where this damaged cargo was stored before disposal." Malvern's composure slipped for the first time, a hesitation so brief she might have missed it had she not been watching him closely. "There's little to see, my lady. Damaged goods are typically disposed of quickly to prevent spoilage from spreading." "Then show me the empty warehouse," Cordelia said. "I should still like to see it." They walked in silence to the 3rd storage building along the quay, a structure large enough to hold the entire contents of a merchant fleet. Malvern unlocked the heavy doors himself, and Cordelia stepped inside to find exactly what the ledgers had claimed. Emptiness, bare stone floors, a few broken crates pushed into one corner, dust undisturbed across most of the space. But it was not the emptiness that troubled her. It was the size of it. 400 barrels of grain, 600 feet of timber, month after month, supposedly ruined and discarded, and yet there was no trace of spoiled goods anywhere, no stains of rotted grain upon the floor, no scent of damp, ruined timber lingering in the air. A warehouse that had allegedly processed the disposal of thousands of pounds worth of cargo looked as though nothing had been stored there at all in months. "This does not add up, Your Grace," she said quietly, turning to face him. "Goods cannot vanish without a trace. If they were truly damaged, there would be evidence of it here. Instead, we have empty ledgers pointing to empty warehouses and money that has gone somewhere it was never meant to go." Benedict's expression had hardened into something she had not yet seen from him, a controlled anger that seemed directed less at her discovery and more at himself. "I confess, Miss Vane, that until this moment, I believed my port operations to be running exactly as recorded." He looked toward Malvern, who stood near the doorway, his earlier smoothness replaced by a careful stillness. "It appears I have placed a great deal of trust in the wrong hands." Cordelia said nothing, though her mind was already working faster than she could speak. Whoever had orchestrated the destruction of her father's fleet 10 years ago had been patient, careful, and skilled at hiding money in plain sight. And now, standing in an empty warehouse that should have held the wreckage of a small fortune, she suspected she was looking at the same hand at work once again. The wedding took place 9 days later at St. Jude's Parish Church in Oakhaven Village, a small stone building with narrow windows and a bell tower that had rung for every Sterling marriage for 3 generations. Cordelia wore a gown of pale gray silk, not the white so many brides favored, chosen because it was the only fine dress she owned that did not remind her of better days long past. There were no crowds gathered outside the church, no carriages lined along the lane. Only the vicar, a handful of parish officials, and the senior heads of the Sterling estate stood as witness. Cordelia found the smallness of it a mercy. She had expected, when Benedict first proposed this arrangement, that a duke's wedding would draw half the county to gawk at the bride who had once been the daughter of a bankrupt merchant. Instead, Benedict had insisted on privacy, and for reasons she did not fully understand, she was grateful for it. The ceremony itself passed quickly. Vows spoken in the cool morning light, the vicar's voice steady and practiced, the ring cold against her finger as Benedict slid it into place. She watched his hands as he did it, steady and sure, no tremor of nerves or hesitation, and found herself wondering whether he felt anything at all in this moment, or whether it was, to him, simply the final clause of a contract already agreed upon. It was only after the registry was signed, after the small gathering had moved to the drawing room of Oakhaven Hall for a modest wedding breakfast, that Benedict drew her aside from the others. "There is a matter I wish to settle before the day grows any longer," he said, leading her into the study where their arrangement had first been struck. He crossed to his desk and retrieved a folded document, sealed and ready, and set it before her. "What is this?" "Full co-signatory power over every Sterling merchant account, effective from this morning. Not the limited authority the solicitor drafted for our contract, but complete power, equal to my own, over the canal revenues, the shipping ledgers, and the trade house accounts in London." He watched her face as she read it. "It is more than most duchesses are given in a lifetime, Cordelia. I am aware of that." She looked up from the paper, startled by the use of her given name, the first time he had spoken it aloud. "Why? You could have kept the terms as they were. I would have had no grounds to object." Benedict was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last of the wedding guests could be seen crossing the courtyard toward their carriages. "Because after what we discovered at Rivermouth, I no longer believe I can trust my own house to tell me the truth of its own accounts." I need someone with eyes as sharp as yours looking at every ledger that crosses this estate. Someone who will not simply nod along to whatever Malvern or anyone else chooses to report." He turned back to her. "I did not marry you only to secure a trade advantage, Cordelia. Whatever I said in this room a fortnight ago. I married you because I need an ally I can trust completely, and because you are the first person in years who has looked at my accounts and seen what was truly there, rather than what I was told to see." Cordelia said nothing for a long moment, turning the paper over in her hands. It was strange, hearing him speak so plainly of trust, when trust was the very thing she had come into this marriage lacking. She had agreed to become his wife, not for partnership, but for access, for the chance to trace the theft that had ruined her family. And yet here he stood, offering her more power than she had asked for, seemingly unaware that she carried a secret of her own, tucked away in the lining of an old trunk. "You said Malvern has managed your family's shipping and canal interests for years," she said carefully. "Long enough to know every account, every contract, every route. Since before my father died, he served my father faithfully, or so I always believed." Benedict's jaw tightened. "It is a difficult thing to suspect a man who has stood at your side since past, but difficult or not, the warehouse we saw cannot be explained away as an accident of poor bookkeeping. Someone has been moving money out of my accounts for a long while, and I intend to find out how far it reaches." Cordelia thought of the bill of transfer folded in her writing desk at home, the anonymous holding group that had purchased her father's charters for almost nothing. She thought of how neatly the timing lined up. 10 years passed, the same years Malvern had held his position of trust within the Sterling household. It could be coincidence. Trade fraud was not uncommon, and dishonest stewards were hardly a rarity among great estates. But something in her instincts, sharpened by years of reading her father's ledgers for signs of trouble, told her this was no coincidence at all. "There is something I have not yet told you," she said finally, and watched Benedict's expression shift to careful attention. "When I went to reconsider your proposal, I searched through my father's old papers. I found a bill of sale, dated shortly before his ruin, showing that his shipping charters were sold to an anonymous holding group for a fraction of their worth. My father never spoke of it. I do not believe he chose to sell them at all." Benedict went very still. "You suspect the same hand behind both?" "I suspect it is possible," Cordelia said, "and I intend to find out for certain, Your Grace, whatever the answer costs either of us." For the first time since she had walked into his study weeks ago, Benedict looked at her not as a business partner or a convenient solution to his troubles, but as someone standing beside him in genuine uncertainty, both of them facing the same unraveling thread. "Then we search together," he said quietly, "and we do not stop until we know the whole of it." The library at Oakhaven Hall stretched the length of the West Wing, its shelves heavy with account books, stretching back 3 generations of sterling trade. Cordelia had spent every evening since the wedding within these walls, a lamp burning beside her, long after the rest of the household had retired, cross-referencing her father's papers against the sterling records Benedict had granted her the authority to examine. It was on the 4th night that she found it. She had been working backward through the historical shipping ledgers, searching for any record of a holding group acquiring charters along the coast, a decade past, when a bundle of correspondence, tucked at the back of an old account book, caught her attention. The papers were brittle with age, tied together with faded ribbon, filed under a heading that read simply, "Coastal Acquisitions, 1816. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and began to read. Letters between the Sterling estate and a firm identified only by initials. arranging the purchase of shipping routes along Rivermouth Port and 2 smaller harbors further south, the very same routes her father had once held. The very same price, almost to the shilling, that had appeared on the bill of transfer she had discovered in her own trunk weeks before. But it was the final document in the bundle that made her breath catch, a transfer of authority, bearing the official seal of the Duke of Stirling, granting the anonymous holding group legal claim to the purchased charters. The seal was unmistakable, pressed in dark wax, the Stirling crest as clear as the one stamped upon Benedict's own correspondence. She carried the bundle to Benedict's study at once, though the hour was late enough that a servant had to be sent to wake him. He arrived in his shirt sleeves, hair unkempt from sleep, his expression sharpening into full alertness the moment he saw what she carried. "I found the transfer," Cordelia said, setting the papers before him with hands that would not quite steady. "The purchase of my father's charters. It bears your family's seal, Benedict. Someone authorized this sale using the authority of the Duke of Stirling." He read through the documents in silence, his face growing paler with each page, until he reached the final transfer and went very still. "This is dated the spring of 1816, he said slowly. "Yes, I was in Europe that spring. My father had sent me on an extended tour of the continent to observe trade practices in the northern ports before I came of age to manage the estate myself. I did not return to England until the autumn." He looked up at her, and there was something raw in his expression now, something close to fear. "Cordelia, I was not in the country when this seal was pressed. I never authorized this purchase. I did not even know it existed until this moment." "Then who did?" "The seal itself is kept under lock in this very study, accessible only to myself and to whoever holds delegated authority in my absence." His jaw tightened, and Cordelia watched understanding settle over him like a physical weight. "My father was gravely ill that spring, confined to his rooms more often than not. Malvern held delegated authority over estate matters during that period, by my father's own order, given his failing health. The name hung in the room between them, heavier now than it had been in the warehouse at Rivermouth. He had access to the seal," Cordelia said quietly. "He had the authority to press it upon any document he chose, and no one would have questioned it, since it carried your father's blessing. And my father, in his final illness, would not have had the strength to review every transaction crossing his desk. He trusted Malvern to manage what he could no longer manage himself." Benedict sat down heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face. "It is one thing to suspect a man of skimming profits from warehouse ledgers, Cordelia. It is another entirely to learn he used my family's own authority, my father's failing trust, to destroy another family's livelihood for his own gain." Cordelia pulled a chair close and sat across from him, the bundle of letters still spread between them upon the desk. "There is something else that troubles me. Why would Malvern go to such lengths to acquire my father's charters, specifically? He did not simply buy failing shipping routes at a low price, as any opportunist might. He orchestrated my father's ruin first, canceling contracts, turning insurers against him, until the charters were worthless enough to purchase for almost nothing. That is not the behavior of a man seizing an opportunity. That is the behavior of a man executing a plan." Benedict considered this, his eyes moving over the old correspondence once more. "If he planned my father's ruin as carefully as he appears to have planned yours, then Malvern has spent a decade building something far larger than a stolen shipping route. He has had access to 2 great trading houses, mine and, through this fraud, the remnants of yours, and no one watching closely enough to notice how the profits were truly flowing. Then we must find where they have been flowing, Cordelia said. Every falsified loss at Rivermouth, every shilling written off as damaged cargo, has to have gone somewhere. Money does not simply vanish, Benedict. It moves. It hides in accounts, in names that do not draw suspicion. He looked at her then, and something in his expression had shifted since the day in his study when he first proposed this arrangement, something that had grown steadier and more certain with each discovery they uncovered together. There are records at the Royal Exchange in London, charter registrations, original deeds, filings that even Malvern would not have had cause to alter, since they are held under guild authority rather than estate authority. If the truth exists anywhere beyond what he controls, it will be there. Cordelia gathered the bundle of letters carefully, tying the faded ribbon once more, and felt for the first time since her father's death something close to the possibility of justice within her reach. Then we go to London, she said, and we find out exactly how deep this deception runs. The carriage ride to London took the better part of 2 days, the roads rough with autumn mud, the countryside slowly giving way to the crowded streets and coal smoke air of the capital. Cordelia spent much of the journey with her father's old correspondence spread across her lap, comparing the careful, looping script of his letters against the fraudulent transfer documents she had found in the Sterling Library, searching for any detail that might point toward the truth before they even reached the exchange. Benedict, seated across from her, watched the passing countryside with the quiet, coiled tension of a man bracing himself for a discovery he already feared. He had said little since they departed Oakhaven Hall, though Cordelia noticed the way his hand occasionally strayed to the leather satchel beside him, where he carried the letters bearing his family's stolen seal. "You have grown quiet, Your Grace," she said, breaking the silence somewhere past the halfway point of their journey. "I am attempting to prepare myself for what we may find." He turned from the window to look at her. It is one thing to suspect a man of betrayal from the safety of one's own study. It is another to walk into the Royal Exchange and have that suspicion confirmed before witnesses who have known my family for generations. "Would you rather not know?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "I would rather know the whole truth and lose every ounce of pride in the process than continue governing an estate built upon a lie I never agreed to." He paused. "My father trusted Malvern with everything in his final years. If that trust was betrayed as thoroughly as I now believe, then Malvern did not simply steal from my family's accounts. He stole from a dying man who could no longer protect what he had spent a lifetime building." Cordelia said nothing to that, though she understood the particular ache in his voice better than he perhaps realized. She had spent 10 years believing her father's ruin was simply misfortune, bad luck, compounded by his own failings as a merchant. To learn now that it had been deliberate, engineered by a man who had likely smiled at her family across a dinner table more than once in those years, settled a cold and steady anger in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel until this journey began. They arrived at the Royal Exchange on a gray afternoon. The great stone building crowded with merchants and clerks moving between the covered arcades, the air filled with the ceaseless murmur of trade being conducted in every corner. Benedict's name carried enough weight that they were shown promptly into the records office, where an elderly clerk named Mr. Pembridge, who had apparently served the guild's archive for the better part of 40 years, brought out the original charter filings from a decade past at Benedict's request. Cordelia worked methodically through the stacks of parchment, her eyes trained by years of reading her father's handwriting to notice the smallest inconsistencies in penmanship, the particular slant of certain letters, the pressure of a quill upon paper. She compared the original Vane charter registrations, signed in her father's own hand years before his ruin, against the transfer documents that had stripped those charters away. It was nearing dusk, the clerk's office lit by a single oil lamp, when she found the document that changed everything. "Benedict," she said quietly, and something in her voice made him cross the room at once. "Look at this signature." She held up the original filing that had authorized the sale of her father's charters to the anonymous holding group, the same document type as the one they had discovered in the Sterling Library. But this one bore a witness signature required under guild law for any charter transfer above a certain value. The witness had signed simply as G. Malvern, steward of the Sterling estate. "This is his hand," Cordelia said. "I have seen enough of Malvern's correspondence at Rivermouth to know the particular way he forms his letters. Look at the loop on the capital M, the way he crosses his T's with a flourish at the end, rather than a straight line. It matches the transfer document from your own library exactly, Benedict. Not merely as a witness this time, but as the very hand that drafted both documents." Benedict took the paper from her, his eyes moving between the two documents she had laid side by side upon the clerk's table. His jaw tightened as recognition settled over his features. The last thread of doubt he had, perhaps still been holding on to, finally severed. "It is his hand," he confirmed quietly. "I have read enough of his weekly reports over the years to know it as well as my own. He did not simply witness this fraud, Cordelia. He orchestrated it from beginning to end, using my family's authority to destroy yours, and quietly claiming the profits for himself, while both our fathers were too consumed with other matters to notice." Mr. Pembridge, who had been observing the exchange with growing unease, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if I may, the steward in question, Mr. Malvern, has visited this office on several occasions over the years, always alone, always requesting access to older filings under the authority of the Sterling estate. I assumed it entirely proper at the time, given his position." "How many occasions?" Benedict asked sharply. "I could not say precisely, Your Grace. Perhaps a dozen, spread across many years. He was always thorough in his requests, always careful to leave the archive exactly as he found it." Cordelia exchanged a glance with Benedict, understanding passing silently between them. A dozen visits, spread across a decade, meant this was no single act of opportunistic theft. It was a pattern maintained with patience and precision, a man returning again and again to ensure his fraud remained buried beneath layers of proper documentation. "We have what we need," Benedict said finally, gathering the documents with careful hands. "Mr. Pembridge, I will require certified copies of every filing bearing Malvern's hand to be sent to my solicitor within the week." As they left the exchange and stepped into the darkening London street, Cordelia felt the weight of the discovery settle heavily between them, no longer suspicion, but certainty. Somewhere behind them, unaware his carefully constructed deception had finally been unraveled, Geoffrey Malvern remained at Oakhaven, still trusted, still smiling, still standing at the center of an estate he had spent 10 years quietly bleeding dry. They left London the following morning, eager to return to Oakhaven before Malvern could sense any change in the wind. Benedict had sent word ahead to his solicitor, arranging for the certified copies from the Royal Exchange to follow within days, but he wished to reach the estate himself before any formal action was taken, to observe Malvern's behavior without the man suspecting his fraud had already been uncovered. The journey home took them along the post road through Buckinghamshire, the carriage rattling over ruts left by weeks of autumn rain. Cordelia sat with the certified copies of the charter documents secured in a leather case at her feet, unwilling to let them out of her sight after everything it had taken to find them. Benedict was quieter than he had been on the journey to London, his earlier tension replaced by something colder and more focused, the look of a man calculating his next move rather than dreading it. They were perhaps 3 hours from High Wycombe when the carriage lurched violently to one side, a sharp crack sounding beneath them like a branch snapping underfoot, though far louder and more grinding. The vehicle tilted, throwing Cordelia against the door, before the driver managed to bring the horses to a halt on the narrow verge of the road. Benedict was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, calling to the coachman, who was already climbing down to inspect the damage. Cordelia followed more slowly, gathering her skirts against the mud, and found the men crouched beside the rear wheel, where the axle had given way entirely, the carriage listing at an unnatural angle. "How far to the nearest inn?" Benedict asked the coachman, his voice tight. "The Fox and Crown, your grace, perhaps 2 miles further along. I can send word for a wheelwright, though it will likely be morning before repairs can be made." There was little choice but to walk the remaining distance, the coachman leading the horses, while Benedict and Cordelia followed on foot along the darkening road. The inn, when they reached it, was modest but warm, a low-beamed common room with a fire crackling in the hearth and a handful of travelers nursing tankards of ale. The innkeeper's wife fussed over them at once, seeing the quality of their traveling clothes despite the mud, and arranged for a private room and a hot meal before the hour grew much later. It was not until the following morning, when a local wheelwright arrived to examine the broken axle, that the true nature of the accident became clear. "This were no ordinary break, your grace," the wheelwright said, turning the damaged iron pin over in his weathered hands for Benedict and Cordelia both to see. "Look here, at the edges. A pin snapping from wear looks rough, jagged, like it's been ground down slow by years of use. This one's been filed clean through, near half its width, deliberate-like. Someone wanted this axle to give out, and wanted it done in a way that'd look like ordinary bad luck to anyone not looking close." Cordelia felt the color drain from her face as she examined the pin herself, the smooth, deliberate groove unmistakable once the wheelwright pointed it out. When would such a thing have been done? "Hard to say for certain, my lady, but a job this careful would take some time, and likely someone with proper access to the carriage house. Not the sort of thing done in a hurried moment on the open road." Benedict's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness Cordelia had come to recognize as barely contained fury. "The carriage was stabled at Oakhaven before our journey to London, and again the night before our departure back." "Malvern," Cordelia said quietly, once the wheelwright had been paid and sent on his way, leaving them alone in the private room upstairs. "He would have known which carriage we intended to travel in. He has access to every corner of the estate, including the carriage house. But how could he know we suspected him? We gave no indication of our purpose before departing for London. I told the staff only that we traveled on estate business." Cordelia paced the small room, her mind working quickly through the possibilities. "Mr. Pembridge said Malvern had visited the Exchange archive a dozen times over the years, always careful to leave no trace of his presence. A man that cautious would not simply assume his fraud remained safely buried. He may have arranged for word of our visit to reach him, some contact within the guild offices, someone paid to alert him should anyone come asking after those particular filings. Then he knows," Benedict said grimly. "He knows we have found the truth, and rather than wait to see what we intend to do with it, he has decided to remove the threat before we can act upon it." The realization settled between them with cold weight. This was no longer a matter of quietly gathering evidence and presenting it through proper legal channels. Malvern had shown, with the deliberate sabotage of their carriage, that he was willing to risk far more than his position and reputation to protect whatever remained of his decade-long deception. "We cannot wait for the wheelwright to properly repair the carriage," Cordelia said. "If Malvern believes we suspect him, he will not simply wait to be confronted. He will destroy whatever records remain at Oakhaven that might further implicate him and disappear before any magistrate can be summoned." Benedict was already moving toward the door, calling for the innkeeper to have 2 horses saddled at once. "The main trade office holds the current ledgers, the ones recording every transaction of the past several years. If he means to erase evidence, that is where he will begin." "Then we ride ahead," Cordelia said, gathering her cloak. "Tonight, before he has time to finish whatever he intends." They left within the hour, riding hard through the darkness along roads still slick with autumn rain. The certified documents from the Royal Exchange secured carefully within Benedict's coat. Cordelia had not ridden at such a pace in years, her arms aching, her breath coming ragged in the cold night air. But she did not slow, driven forward by the same fear that drove Benedict beside her. Somewhere ahead of them, at the trade office he had trusted for over a decade, Geoffrey Malvern was very likely already at work destroying the last proof of everything he had stolen. They reached Oakhaven village well before dawn, the horses lathered and exhausted beneath them, and rode straight for the trade office rather than the hall itself. The building stood dark from the outside, no lamps burning in its windows, and for one terrible moment, Cordelia feared they had arrived too late, that Malvern had already come and gone, taking whatever proof remained with him into the night. But as Benedict dismounted and approached the side entrance, he stopped short, holding up a hand for silence. A faint orange glow flickered from beneath the door, unmistakably firelight, and beneath the crack of the doorframe drifted the acrid smell of burning paper. He did not knock. He threw the door open with enough force that it struck the wall behind it, and Cordelia followed close behind him into the main record room, where Geoffrey Malvern stood before the hearth, a stack of ledgers in his arms, feeding pages one by one into the flames. Malvern froze at the sound of the door, his composed features slipping into something raw and startled before he mastered himself, setting the remaining ledgers down upon a nearby table with deliberate calm, as though he had simply been tidying old records rather than caught in the act of destroying them. "Your Grace," he said, his voice steady, despite the sweat visible upon his brow, "I did not expect you back so soon. I trust the journey to London proved fruitful." "Do not," Benedict said, his voice dangerously low, "insult either of us by pretending this is anything other than what it appears to be." Cordelia moved past him to the hearth, where the last curling remains of burned paper drifted upward in the draught. Enough pages remained unburned upon the table that she could see, even from a distance, the familiar columns of shipping figures, the same handwriting she had spent days learning to recognize. "We visited the Royal Exchange, Mr. Malvern," she said, drawing the certified copies from the leather case Benedict had carried through the ride. She set them upon the table beside the half-burned ledgers. "We examined the original charter filings from 10 years past. We found the transfer documents authorizing the sale of my father's shipping routes, bearing the seal of the Duke of Stirling, pressed by a hand-delegated authority during a period when the Duke himself was traveling abroad and entirely unaware of the transaction." Malvern said nothing, his eyes moving from the documents to Cordelia's face and back again. "We also found your signature, Mr. Malvern," Benedict added, stepping forward, "as witness to a transfer you yourself drafted." Mr. Pembridge at the Exchange Archive was kind enough to recall your numerous visits over the years, always alone, always requesting access to filings that had no proper business concerning a steward's duties. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the fire crackling in the hearth, consuming the last of whatever pages Malvern had not yet managed to destroy. Then, slowly, something in his posture changed. The careful deference he had worn for years, the bowed head and smooth, accommodating manner, fell away entirely, replaced by something colder and more exhausted, as though he had simply grown tired of carrying the performance any longer. "You have no notion what it was to serve this family," he said quietly, "watching profits I built with my own hands pass into the pockets of men who never troubled themselves to understand a single ledger they inherited. Your father," he looked at Benedict now, "was a decent man, but a foolish one, in matters of trade, content to let others manage what he could not be bothered to learn himself. When his health began to fail, and the authority fell to me, I saw an opportunity I had waited years to seize." "By destroying my family," Cordelia said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The vain shipping routes were the missing piece," Malvern said, turning to her. "Your father's charters, combined with the Sterling Canal network, would have created wealth beyond what either family alone could achieve. But I could not simply purchase them outright. Your father was too proud, too attached to his father's legacy, to ever willingly sell, so I made certain he had no choice." He said it without apparent remorse, as though describing the mechanics of a trade rather than the ruin of a man's life. "Cancelled contracts here, withdrawn insurance there, each step small enough to pass as misfortune. By the time his creditors closed in, he was desperate enough to sell for whatever price my anonymous buyer offered, never suspecting the buyer and I were one and the same. And my father's fortune, once you controlled both trade routes?" Benedict asked, skimmed carefully. "Over years, disguised as damaged cargo, spoiled shipments, the ordinary losses any merchant house expects to absorb, enough to build a fortune of my own, quietly, while both families remained locked in their own private grief, never once looking toward each other, let alone toward me." Malvern's jaw tightened. "I kept you and Miss Vane's family apart deliberately, Your Grace. Had you ever crossed paths? Had you ever compared notes on your respective ruins? You might have seen the pattern years sooner. Instead, you arranged a marriage that placed us directly across from one another," Cordelia said slowly, understanding settling over her with sudden clarity, never anticipating that combining our families through marriage would combine our knowledge as well. Malvern's silence was answer enough. Benedict stepped forward and gathered the remaining unburned ledgers from the table, along with the certified copies Cordelia had brought from London. "You will remain here, under guard, until the magistrate can be summoned from the county town. Every account you have touched over the past decade will be examined, every shilling traced, until the full extent of your theft is known." Malvern did not attempt to flee, nor did he offer any further protest. He simply stood before the dying fire, the ruin of his careful decade-long scheme scattered across the table before him, and said nothing at all as two of Benedict's men, summoned from the stables, arrived to escort him from the building. Cordelia watched him go, and felt not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted relief, the weight of 10 years of unanswered questions, finally settling into something she could understand, something she could at last put right. Word of Malvern's arrest spread through Oakhaven within days, though the full truth of his decade-long fraud remained known only to Benedict, Cordelia, and the handful of solicitors now working to trace every falsified ledger back to its origin. The annual trade summit, however, could not be postponed. It had been fixed upon the calendar months before any of this had come to light, and the senior investors and titled shareholders who held stakes in the Sterling Canal network were already traveling toward Oakhaven by the time Malvern stood confined, awaiting the magistrate's arrival. Cordelia had not expected to attend the summit at all, assuming it fell entirely within Benedict's domain as head of the estate, but he insisted otherwise. "You uncovered every thread of this fraud before I had any notion it existed," he told her the evening before the gathering. "You will stand beside me when I present it to the board, not behind me." The great hall at Oakhaven had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables arranged beneath the high wooden beams, portraits of sterling ancestors watching down upon the assembled company of perhaps 30 men, minor lords and merchant investors alike, all with considerable sums resting upon the stability of the canal network's returns. Cordelia wore the deep green gown Benedict's tailor had made for her since the wedding, her hair arranged with more care than she had allowed herself since her father's death, though she felt none of the confidence her appearance suggested as she took her place at Benedict's side. It was perhaps an hour into the proceedings, after Benedict had begun explaining the discovery of Malvern's fraud in careful, measured terms, that a voice rose from among the gathered investors, sharp with objection. "Your Grace, if I may." The speaker was Lord Ashcombe, an elderly investor with considerable holdings in the canal shares, his expression skeptical as he rose from his seat. "You ask us to accept that your own steward, a man trusted by this board for years, orchestrated a fraud spanning a decade, and yet the evidence you present rests largely upon the word of your new Duchess, a woman whose own family's ruin appears rather conveniently connected to the very scheme she claims to have uncovered." A murmur passed through the hall, and Cordelia felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes turning toward her, doubt written plainly across several faces. "With respect, Lord Ashcombe," Benedict began, but Cordelia laid a hand gently upon his arm, silencing him before he could finish. "Allow me to answer for myself, Your Grace." She stepped forward, drawing from the leather case she had carried into the hall a careful reconstruction of the accounts she and Benedict had spent the past days assembling with the solicitor's help. "Lord Ashcombe raises a fair question. I will answer it not with my word, but with figures, since figures do not lie, whatever suspicions may be cast upon the person presenting them." She spread the reconstructed ledger across the nearest table, inviting the assembled investors closer as she began to walk them through it, page by page. The falsified losses at Rivermouth Port, each entry cross-referenced against warehouse inventories that showed no trace of the damaged cargo supposedly written off. The handwriting analysis comparing Malvern's correspondence against the fraudulent transfer documents from the Royal Exchange. The pattern of his repeated, unexplained visits to the Guild archives over the course of a decade, each visit coinciding precisely with a further erosion of the canal network's reported profits. Every shilling written off as spoiled grain or damaged timber over these years, she said, her voice steady, despite the scrutiny of the room, amounts to a sum I have calculated here, in this final column. Nearly £11,000 diverted from the accounts of every investor seated in this hall, disguised as ordinary trade losses no one thought to question, because no one imagined a trusted steward capable of such patient deception. The hall had grown very quiet. Lord Ashcombe leaned forward to examine the figures himself, his earlier skepticism giving way slowly to something more troubled as he traced the columns with his own finger. "This figure," he said finally, "matches almost precisely the shortfall my own solicitor flagged in my quarterly returns 3 years past. I assumed it an error in my own accounting. It was no error, my lord, Cordelia said. It was theft, carefully hidden behind the ordinary language of trade losses that no investor thinks to scrutinize too closely, precisely because such losses are common enough to seem unremarkable. One by one, other investors began to speak, each recalling some small discrepancy in their own returns over recent years, some unexplained shortfall they had dismissed as the ordinary cost of maritime trade. The pattern Cordelia had laid before them, once seen clearly, could not easily be unseen, and the doubt that had greeted her at the summit's opening began to shift, slowly, into something closer to respect. Miss Vane, that is, Your Grace, Lord Ashcombe corrected himself. I confess I spoke hastily earlier. It appears this board owes you a debt of gratitude rather than suspicion. Had you not possessed the particular skill to trace this fraud through years of carefully falsified records, I doubt any of us would have discovered it before our own fortunes were entirely drained. Murmurs of agreement rose from around the hall, and Benedict, standing beside her, allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, the first Cordelia had seen from him since Malvern's arrest. The board recognizes the Duchess of Stirling's contribution, Lord Ashcombe continued, raising his voice to address the full assembly, and I move that she be granted full standing among us as co-director of the combined trade network, given the evident sharpness of her judgment in matters that have escaped the notice of this board for the better part of a decade. The motion carried, without a single voice, raised in dissent, and Cordelia stood in the great hall, surrounded by men who had questioned her legitimacy not an hour before, now offering her the very authority she had once believed she would have to fight for the rest of her life to earn. The magistrates' court sat in the county town 3 weeks later, a modest brick building where matters of theft and fraud among the gentry were rarely heard. The local magistrate, accustomed more to disputes over grazing rights and petty debts than the unraveling of a decade-long conspiracy against two great trading houses. Cordelia sat beside Benedict on a hard wooden bench at the front of the room, the certified evidence from the Royal Exchange, the reconstructed ledgers, and the sworn testimony of Mr. Pembridge, all arranged carefully before the presiding magistrate, a stern-faced man named Justice Whitfield, who had spent the better part of the morning reviewing the case with evident disbelief at its scope. Geoffrey Malvern stood before the bench, no longer dressed in the fine coat and polished boots of a trusted steward, but in plainer clothes befitting a man awaiting judgment rather than commanding an estate. He had said little throughout the proceedings, offering no defense beyond a resigned acknowledgment of the facts laid before him, as though the exhaustion of maintaining his deception for so many years had finally settled upon him in full, once there was no longer any purpose in denial. The evidence before this court, Justice Whitfield said, addressing the room, demonstrates a fraud of remarkable patience and precision, spanning some 10 years, resulting in the ruin of one merchant family and the significant diminishment of another's fortune, along with financial harm to numerous investors of standing within this county. Mr. Malvern, you held a position of considerable trust, delegated authority over estate matters during a period when the Duke of Stirling's father lay gravely ill and unable to oversee his own affairs. You used that trust not to serve the family who relied upon you, but to enrich yourself at their expense, and at the expense of an innocent family who had done you no wrong. Malvern said nothing, his eyes fixed upon some point on the floor before him. This court orders the immediate seizure of all assets traced to your fraudulent gains, to be returned in full to the Stirling Vane Trust, as calculated by the accounts submitted before this bench. Justice Whitfield's voice remained level, though there was a hardness beneath it that had not been present at the start of the proceedings. You are further barred permanently from any position of financial trust within the Merchant Guild, its records to reflect this judgment for the benefit of any future employer who might otherwise be deceived as thoroughly as the Sterling family was deceived. You are remanded to the county bailiff to await trial upon the full charge of grand embezzlement, a matter I have no doubt will result in considerable consequence given the scale of what has been proven here today. The bailiff stepped forward to lead Malvern from the room, and for the first time since his arrest, he turned to look at Cordelia directly, something unreadable passing across his weathered features. "You have your father's eyes for figures, my lady," he said quietly, before the bailiff drew him toward the door. "I underestimated what that inheritance would cost me." Cordelia said nothing in return, watching him go, and found that the moment carried none of the satisfaction she might once have imagined. Only a quiet, settled relief, the closing of a wound that had remained open for 10 years without her ever fully understanding its cause. The formal transfer of assets took the better part of the following week. Solicitors from both the Sterling estate and the reconstituted Vane Trust, working through the details of restitution with meticulous care. The seized funds, traced through years of falsified accounts, were returned to the Sterling Vane Trust in full, a sum considerable enough to settle every remaining debt from her father's ruin many times over, with a substantial fortune left besides. But it was the final document, drawn up by Benedict's solicitor and signed before witnesses in the same study where their strange arrangement had first begun, that meant the most to Cordelia. The original trade charters, once belonging solely to her father and lost to Malvern's scheme a decade past, were formally restored and amended to list Cordelia Sterling, née Vane, as equal managing director of the combined maritime fleet and canal networks, her authority equal to Benedict's own in every respect the law allowed. "You once told me," Benedict said, as he set down his pen after signing the final page, "that you came to my study seeking employment as an estate manager. I recall telling you I had no need of one." He looked up at her, something warm in his expression that had not been there in their first meeting, when he had regarded her with nothing more than cautious calculation. "It seems I was wrong on both accounts, Cordelia. I had considerable need of you, though not in the capacity either of us first imagined. You offered me a wife's position when I asked for a servant's wage," Cordelia said, allowing herself a small smile. "I confess I did not expect, when I accepted, that I would end this arrangement holding equal claim to an empire twice the size of what either of our families held alone. Nor did I expect," Benedict said, rising from his desk to stand beside her, "that the woman I married to settle a business arrangement would prove the very reason I still have a fortune left to share with her at all." Outside the study window, the autumn light had begun to soften into the pale gold of early winter, the canal barges visible in the distance, moving steadily along the water toward Rivermouth Port, carrying cargo that would, for the first time in years, be recorded honestly from origin to destination. Cordelia watched them for a long moment, thinking of her father, of the ledgers she had kept at his side as a girl, of everything that had been taken and was now, finally, restored. "Then let us see what this restored empire can become," she said, "now that it belongs to both of us in truth, and not merely on paper." 1 month had passed since Cordelia first walked through the doors of Oakhaven Hall with her father's ledgers tucked beneath her arm, desperate for nothing more than a wage to settle debts she had believed were hers alone to carry. Standing now upon the crest of Oakhaven Hill, the wind pulling loose strands of hair from beneath her bonnet, She found it difficult to reconcile that anxious young woman with the one who stood here today, looking down upon a trade empire that bore her name alongside her husband's. Below them, the canal lock system stretched toward the horizon, barges moving steadily through the water, their cargo holds filled with timber and grain, bound honestly for market, every shipment now recorded with the same careful precision Cordelia had once applied to her father's books as a girl of 15. The warehouses at Rivermouth, once emptied by fraud, disguised as misfortune, stood full again, overseen by clerks who understood their ledgers would be checked, and checked thoroughly, by a duchess who had proven she could catch a false entry from across a crowded room. Benedict stood beside her, his coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the same view with an expression she had come to know well over the past weeks. Not the cautious, calculating stillness of the man who had once proposed marriage to her as though negotiating the terms of a shipping contract, but something softer, settled, a man who had found, in the unraveling of his family's greatest betrayal, an unexpected partnership he had never thought to hope for. "I received a letter this morning from Lord Ashcombe," Benedict said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "He writes that the board wishes to formally record the combined enterprise under a new name, one reflecting both families equally, rather than continuing under the Sterling name alone." Cordelia turned to him, surprised. What name did he propose? "He left that decision to us." Benedict's mouth curved into something close to a smile. "Though I confess, I have given the matter some thought myself. The Sterling Vane Trading Company has a certain weight to it, does it not? A name that acknowledges what was lost and what has since been reclaimed. My father would have liked that," Cordelia said quietly, feeling the familiar ache of his absence, though softened now by something that had not existed a month before. Not merely grief, but a kind of quiet vindication, the knowledge that his name would not be remembered as a cautionary tale of ruin and failure, but restored to the standing it had always deserved. She thought of the long nights in the Oakhaven library, cross-referencing brittle old ledgers by candlelight, and the empty warehouse at Rivermouth that had first confirmed her suspicions. She thought of the fraudulent seal pressed upon documents a decade past, of Malvern's careful, patient cruelty stretched across 10 years, and of the moment in the trade office when his composure had finally broken before the weight of certified evidence he could no longer deny. Every step of it had led here, to this hill, to this view, to a partnership neither of them had sought, but both had come, in time, to value beyond the terms of any contract. "There is something else I wish to say to you," Benedict said, turning to face her fully now, the wind catching at his coat. "When I first proposed this arrangement, I told you I needed a wife more than a servant. I meant it then only in terms of the trade advantage our combined names might offer. I did not understand, at the time, what I was truly asking for." "And what were you asking for, Your Grace?" Cordelia asked, though her tone had softened from the wary formality she had once used to guard herself against him. "Someone who would look at my accounts and see the truth rather than what she was told to see. Someone whose judgment I could trust completely, in matters of business and matters far beyond it." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers. "I did not know, when I made you that offer in my study, that I was asking for a partner in every sense of the word, not merely a duchess to bear my name, but a woman whose mind and courage would prove equal to any challenge this estate might face." "I am fortunate you agreed to my terms, Cordelia, however coldly I first presented them," Cordelia felt warmth spread through her chest, despite the cold wind sweeping across the hillside, a feeling she had not expected to find within a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a desperate bargain struck to settle her father's debts. You once said a servant follows instruction, while a wife shares in consequence and reward. I did not fully understand what you meant by that, not until we stood together in that empty warehouse, or rode through the night to reach the trade office before Malvern could destroy the last of his lies. And do you understand it now? I understand that consequence shared is lighter than consequence carried alone, Cordelia said, and that I have not felt truly alone since the morning I walked into your study, expecting to be turned away. Below them, a barge sounded its horn as it approached the lock, the sound carrying faintly up the hillside on the wind. Cordelia watched it pass, thinking of everything that had changed since that first cold meeting in Benedict's study, the desperate plea for employment that had transformed, through fraud uncovered and justice finally served, into a legitimate empire built upon truth rather than deception. Her family's name had been restored, not merely cleared of the shame that had clung to it for a decade, but elevated to stand equal alongside one of the great trading houses of England. Her father's debts, once a crushing weight she had carried alone through cold London streets and rented rooms above a chandler's shop, existed now only as a distant memory, settled many times over by the restitution Malvern's crimes had finally yielded. "Shall we go down and see how the new lock gates are holding?" Benedict asked, offering his arm. Cordelia took it, casting one last look across the empire spread below them, hers now by right and by earned respect rather than mere marriage contract, before turning to walk down the hillside beside the husband who had once offered her a wife's position and given her, in the end, so very much more than she had ever thought to ask for.